All right, so welcome everyone. Greetings. Thank you for joining us today for today's talk. This is going to be the ninth presentation in the Mind Foundation's ongoing Philosopher Speaker Series. My name is Michael Kramer. I will be the I will be the moderator for today's session. I am the co-speaker for the Philosophy Professional section within Mind. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session, Dr. Eric Steinhart. So Dr. Steinhart grew up on a farm in the magical culture of the Pennsylvania Germans. He is presently a professor of philosophy at William Patterson University, located in New Jersey. He works primarily on metaphysics using contemporary analytical and logical methods and tools. And he is also interested in historical metaphysical systems, particularly those of Plotinus, the broader tradition of Neoplatonism, and Leibniz. He has become increasingly interested in the philosophy of religion over the recent years, focusing on the intersection of the formal sciences and theology, as well as in exploring alternatives to Abrahamic religion. His degrees are in computer science and in philosophy, and he affirms the existence of transfinitely endless hierarchies of sets, computers, languages, games, strategies, and minds. He is the author of many articles and books, including Your Digital Afterlives, Computational Theories of Life After Death, and Believing in Dawkins, the New Spiritual Atheism. His book, Atheistic Platonism, is forthcoming. The title of his talk today is Spiritual Naturalism and Psychedelics. And with that, I pass it off to Dr. Steinhart.
Okay, well, yes, I am Eric Steinhart, and talking about spiritual naturalism and psychedelics. And let's go through it. So psychedelics are said to reveal a joyous cosmology. And this phrase comes from a book on psychedelics by Alan Watts back in '62. It's been picked up again by Chris Letheby in his Philosophy of Psychedelics in 1921. And I'm going to gloss over the references in the talk. They're there, but the list of references can be found on my website at that address. So the joyous cosmology has 8 points of joy. And the first point of joy is that materialism is false. Second, things are animated by spirits. And 3, nature is filled with spiritual beings. The fourth point is everything is spiritually connected. Then everything is spiritually meaningful. Everything is spiritually optimal. There are many worlds filled with spiritual beings. And finally, the 8th point is that ultimate reality is spiritual. So there's going to be 2 interpretations of the points of joy. And these depend on 2 opposed views about minds. On the supernaturalist interpretation, minds don't depend on brains or their equivalents, and the natural sciences cannot fully account for mentality. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, minds do depend on brains or their equivalents, and the natural sciences can fully account for mentality. Now, on the supernaturalist interpretation of the 8 points of joy, spirituality requires Cartesian mind-body dualism. There's a world of material things, and there's also a world of mysterious immaterial minds, also known as spirits. And these 2 worlds mysteriously interact. This Cartesian dualism is then used to interpret the 8 points of joy and thus psychedelics. So on the supernaturalist interpretation, it's very common in the psychedelic literature. And Letheby, for instance, usually treats it as standard. He talks about, quote, transcendental visions of the joyous cosmology. And on this supernaturalism, Letheby says psychedelics generate metaphysical hallucinations. They provide only comforting delusions, and they're ethically objectionable. But the joyous cosmology does not require supernaturalism. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation of the 8 points of joy, spirituality is going to get cashed out in terms of informational concepts. And Cartesian mind-body dualism on this view is radically false. So information will be used to interpret the 8 points of joy and thus psychedelics. Now, the spiritual naturalist interpretation is less common in the psychedelic literature. Watts does endorse a spiritual naturalist interpretation. He rejects mind-body dualism. And Letheby hints at a spiritual naturalist interpretation, but he doesn't develop it. So I'm going to develop it a little bit here. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, psychedelics generate metaphysical truths, and they're ethically valuable. So I'm going to focus on the spiritual naturalist interpretation. I'll contrast it a little bit with supernaturalism as well. Let's start with the first point of joy. Materialism is false. Psychedelics are said to reveal that materialism is false. We have two interpretations, supernaturalist and spiritual naturalist. On the supernaturalist interpretation, psychedelics reveal that our universe contains a realm of spirits, and the basis of our universe is intelligent and conscious. And so psychedelics reveal the existence of mind at large, or another reality, capital R, that puts this one in the shade. Or they reveal absolute consciousness or universal mind, and they reveal the truth of the perennial philosophy. This has some practical implications for psychedelic research. If we consider the metaphysical beliefs questionnaire, the MBQ, it's based entirely on Cartesian dualism. Every single question assumes a Cartesian opposition of mind and matter, and no ontological alternatives are provided. The questionnaire forces you into a dualist interpretation. Or consider psychedelic integration practices, such as meeting the divine within from the guiding presence. These integration practices often uncritically assume supernaturalism. But supernaturalism, it's widely thought to conflict with science and reason. So I'm going to turn now to spiritual naturalism for this first point of joy. And we'll start with a little background. Ontology is the study of the fundamental structure of existence. And Letheby hints at a relational ontology. He refers to ontic structural realism, which is a view that nature is a purely relational structure. Nature is a network of objects defined by their relations to each other. The network is informational. The basic objects are informational. They're bits or computers, and this is informational structural realism. So nature is a relational network of informational objects, and the relations in the network are also informational. This is radically anti-Cartesian. Information is not mental, and it's not material either. Mind and matter both emerge from information. And if we say information is physical or mathematical, that doesn't imply that it is material. And ultimately, this is going to be a kind of Platonism or derived from Platonism. Here's a little glimpse at an informational cosmology. For instance, material particles are kinks in a network of quantum bits of information. This is the it from qubit program in contemporary physics. The universe itself is a quantum computer, or the universe as a quantum computer is a quantum cellular automaton. And things like the axioms of quantum information theory entail the physical laws of thermodynamics. And things we take to be space and time turn out to be quantum error correcting codes. Just a little glimpse. But let's get back to the first point of joy. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, the basis of our universe is informational. Everything in the universe is a computer, and physical processes are data flows. So materialism is false. Matter emerges from information, the it from qubit program, for instance, and information is not mental. And this is supported by contemporary physics. It's supported by science and reason. This has some practical implications for psychedelics. For instance, make a better metaphysical beliefs questionnaire. Don't assume reality is either mental or material. Ask instead questions about the primacy of information. Things like, I felt like everything was alive with flowing patterns of information, or nature is like the internet, where everything is talking and computing. Those would be some more interesting questions. Let's go now to the second point of joy, that things are animated by spirits. So psychedelics are said to reveal that things are animated by spirits. And on the supernaturalist interpretation, things are animated by Cartesian minds. They're little Cartesian heads with their own homunculi. Great phrase from the anthropologist Kohn. And this view conflicts sharply with science. So let's turn to spiritual naturalism. Some naturalist background. We're going to use information to think about thermodynamics, and information links with thermodynamics via the concept of entropy. Entropy is not disorder. Entropy measures the flatness of some kind of landscape, could be a potential energy landscape, could be some other kind of landscape, but entropy is flatness. And the second law of thermodynamics says that physical systems maximize entropy. The second law generates thermodynamic forces. And if you want to feel a thermodynamic force, just stretch a rubber band. It's actually a thermodynamic force that's pulling it back to relaxation. Surprisingly, the second law drives self-organization. Here's an argument. The maximum entropy production principle says that anything that's not in thermal equilibrium is driven by a thermodynamic force to maximize its entropy production rate. And more complex dynamics turn out to produce entropy faster. So if we're going to maximize entropy, so if the entropy production principle entails maximizing entropy production rates, it's going to entail maximizing complex dynamics. And therefore, anything that's not in thermal equilibrium is driven by a thermodynamic force to maximize its complexity. Thermodynamic forces drive self-organization. Now, we need a name for the thermodynamic force that drives self-organization. A good name comes from Kevin Kelly. He calls it exotropy. Exotropy is a force vector internal to anything not in thermal equilibrium. Exotropy vectors point upwards in complexity space. You can think of Dawkins' Mount improbable. Exotropy vectors point from less designedness to more designedness. You can think here of Dennett's concept of design space. And in this context, the second law is an informational law, and exotropy is an informational force. Now, the Stoics seemed to talk about exotropy. They talked about a pure technikon, the designing fire. Think back to Dennett's design space. The Stoics also used the term pneuma for the pure technikon. And the Greek pneuma is the Latin spiritus, which is the English word spirit. So exotropy looks like the Stoic pneuma and therefore like spirit. On this view, spirit is a natural force. Spirit is just exotropic force. Spirit is informational, but not mental. Information is a physical concept. It's also not material. But a spirit is a localized exotropic force vector, and anything not in thermal equilibrium is animated by a spirit. Let's go back to our second point of joy. Psychedelics induce beliefs in animism. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, this means that things are animated by natural spirits, that is, exotropic vectors. And this view is supported by science. Here's our third point of joy. Nature is filled with spiritual beings. Psychedelics cause mental self-other overlap. They make people project their self-interpretations onto other things. So natural things are seen as copies of the human self as the person conceives of that self. There's two interpretations, supernaturalist and spiritual naturalist. On the supernaturalist self-interpretation, spiritual beings are Cartesian minds, and psychedelics reveal that things contain Cartesian minds. This leads to panpsychism, or the projection of Cartesian mentality into everything. And this supernaturalism affects psychedelic research. For instance, it affects the consciousness attribution questionnaire, which is biased towards Cartesianism. But there's no reason to think Cartesian minds exist, and this is a false spirituality. So let's turn to spiritual naturalism. Here's a little naturalist background. We'll move from information to computers. A computer is an information processing system, and any physical system that's not in thermal equilibrium computes. Information is physical, not mental, and something is a computer means it's animated by spirit. So computers are spiritual machines. It's a nice phrase from Ray Kurzweil, and nature is filled with computers. If we apply this to ourselves on the supernaturalist interpretation, we are Cartesian minds in bodies, and a Cartesian mind is an enduring, simple, immaterial substance. But on the spiritual naturalist interpretation, we are identical with our bodies. Our bodies are spiritual computing machines. Our bodies are animated by thermodynamic spirits, and a human life is a temporally extended computation. Human minds depend on human brains and bodies. If we apply this to biology more generally, non-human organisms are computers too. Bacteria, plants, non-human animals, all computers. All organisms and species are computers, an idea that finds extensive application in contemporary biology. And these computers are animated by thermodynamic spirits. They are, as Kurzweil says, spiritual machines. Applied to ecology, the whole earthly biosphere is a computer. It's animated by thermodynamic spirit. It's not animated by a mind, and this is not the Gaia hypothesis. The earthly biosphere is a spiritual machine. It's a network of computational organisms, and our biosphere is like an internet of spiritual beings. Apply this to astronomy. The sun, the earth, and the moon are all computers. They're all far from thermal equilibrium, and they are animated by thermodynamic spirits. They're not animated by minds. Spirits are not minds. They are spiritual machines, and the solar system is an internet of spiritual beings, an internet of spiritual machines. We go back to the third point of joy. On the spiritual naturalist self-interpretation, spiritual beings are just spiritual machines, and psychedelics reveal that spiritual machines are everywhere. We live in a network, an internet of spiritual machines, and we are spiritual machines. So on the spiritual naturalist self-interpretation, psychedelics show that the Cartesian mind is an illusion. And seeing through this Cartesian illusion is a kind of spiritual enlightenment. So psychedelics, Letheby says, induce the experience of unselfing, which he says is central to spirituality. And in this context, Letheby refers to Iris Murdoch for unselfing. But Murdoch was an atheistic Platonist, and she talked about how unselfing occurs in the ascent to the good. But here the good is a logical object. It's like a proposition or an ideological value. So let's go to our fourth point of joy. Everything is spiritually connected. Psychedelics are said to reveal a universal connectedness, an intensified connection to the self, others, the world, and intensified connections, especially with the environment, with natural things. And psychedelics also reveal that these connections have usually positive value. We have our two interpretations. On the supernaturalist interpretation, the spiritual connections link Cartesian minds, and thus we see a long history in which psychedelics are said to reveal telepathy, clairvoyance, or reception of alien messages from alternative dimensions. This all conflicts very sharply with the scientific worldview. So let's turn to spiritual naturalism. The naturalist background here says that connection is quantum entanglement, and every computer is entangled with every other computer. All the computers in the universe are connected by informational channels. Every computer communicates with every other computer. Usually the entanglements are smeared out into noise, but even noise is communication. There's always a little bit of signal in the noise. And information is spiritual. Information channels are spiritual connections. So spiritual networks are everywhere. There are molecular networks in cells, cellular networks in organisms, biological networks in ecosystems, and mycorrhizal networks between trees and fungi. The entire earthly ecosphere is a spiritual network. There are astronomical networks. For instance, planets and their suns are informationally connected, and stars are informationally connected to central galactic black holes. There we can turn back to some thermodynamic ideas to really cash these out in good physical terms. So let's go back to our fourth point of joy. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, we have spiritual connections to other spiritual machines, and these occur in biological, ecological, and astronomical networks. And for instance, this coheres with Letheby, who also naturalizes these spiritual connections. So these spiritual connections are computational, they're not telepathic. These connections are physical and objective, and they involve information, not mentality, and this is supported by science. Let's go to our fifth point of joy. Everything is spiritually meaningful. Psychedelics reveal these spiritual meanings. They're meaning enhancers. They induce beliefs like all events are meaningful and all events involve signs. They say things like meaning is essential for spirituality. Here we have two interpretations, again, supernaturalist and spiritual naturalist. The supernaturalist interpretation says meanings are produced by immaterial Cartesian minds. And so psychedelics reveal universal mentality. The signs that psychedelics reveal to us show that idealism is true or panpsychism is true. This again conflicts sharply with science, so we'll turn to spiritual naturalism. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, information channels carry signs. All computers communicate using signs, and spiritual meanings are signs produced by spiritual beings, that is, spiritual machines. Spiritual machines, spiritual beings are just computers, and this is pansemiotics. Think here about Charles Sanders Peirce. Everything signifies to everything else, but this isn't panpsychism or idealism. And this is supported by science. Our sixth point of joy says everything is spiritually optimal. And psychedelics are said to induce extremely positively valenced moods like joy or supreme bliss or absolute peace and infinite love. On the supernaturalist interpretation, these point to the existence of some benevolent and providential divine mind or universal consciousness or world self, an all good mind that loves us and cares about us. Again, this conflicts with a scientific worldview, so let's turn to spiritual naturalism. A little naturalist background, computers are driven by exotropy to maximize complexity. And every computer has a purpose. Following that maximum entropy production principle, its purpose is to produce as much complexity as possible by producing entropy as fast as possible. Here, purpose does not require mentality. It's analyzed in terms of thermodynamics, in terms of physics, in terms of information. And complexity here is intrinsically valuable. So every computer that maximizes complexity is maximizing intrinsic value, and every computer is running an optimization algorithm. Back to our sixth point of joy. On the spiritual naturalist interpretation, every computer in the universe runs an optimization algorithm, and the universe itself runs an optimization algorithm. It aims at the Platonic form of the good. Psychedelics induce positively valenced experiences of the universal optimization algorithm. They reveal the ways that existence points to the good. Let's turn to our seventh point of joy. There's many worlds filled with spiritual beings. So psychedelics are often said to induce hallucinatory journeys through alien worlds. They induce entity encounters. And on the supernaturalist interpretation, the worlds are parts of some realm of spirits, or they're aspects of some divine mind. The entities, of course, are spirits. And this conflicts, again, with science. You know the drill. Let's turn to spiritual naturalism. A little naturalist background is this is about modality. Modality deals with possibilities. And modal realists say that other possible worlds exist. The most famous modal realist, probably David Lewis, who thinks that possible worlds are physical structures. Of course, they can be models of mathematical structures, but a Platonist is likely to say that ultimate reality is purely mathematical and that, for instance, all possible mathematical structures exist. The cosmologist Max Tegmark became famous for saying all possible physical structures just are mathematical structures. And on that view, a kind of Platonic or Pythagorean view, all possible worlds just are mathematical structures. If we put this in terms of information, well, mathematical structures are just informational structures. Mathematical structures are often thought to be set theoretic structures. And there are purely informational models of set theory from, for instance, John von Neumann. So mathematical structures can be thought of as purely informational structures, and all possible worlds are ultimately informational structures. We can interpret hallucinations now in terms of possible worlds. David Lewis has a pretty sophisticated theory of hallucinated objects, and he says they exist in other possible worlds. Macbeth sees a dagger before his face, but it's a hallucination. So Lewis asks, where does the dagger exist? And he says Macbeth's dagger exists in another possible world, floating before the eyes of an otherworldly Macbeth who actually sees it. Our world is actual. The others are non-actual. So Macbeth's dagger is physical in its own non-actual world. Hallucinated objects are non-actual physical things, but they are often mistaken for non-physical actual things. And I'll just note the philosopher William Lycan talks about that. And that's an interesting point to stress, how non-actual physical things get mistaken for non-physical actual things. So hallucinated agents exist in other possible worlds too. For instance, Terence McKenna's self-transforming machine elves that you see if you take DMT are non-actual physical agents, which people mistake for non-physical actual agents. So let's go back to our seventh point of joy. Psychedelics induce hallucinatory journeys through alien worlds. And on our spiritual naturalist interpretation, the worlds are Lewisian possible worlds, interpreted using an informational ontology. Hallucinatory objects are non-actual physical things. They're not actual non-physical things. In other words, they're not actual Cartesian minds or spirits. So hallucinatory agents, such as our self-transforming elf machines, are non-actual bodies. There actually are such things. They're entirely physical, but they don't exist in our world. They exist in other worlds. And when we hallucinate, we see things in other possible worlds. There's no need here for supernaturalism. The other possible worlds, the Lewisian possible worlds, are analyzable in terms of scientific concepts such as mathematical physics. So we turn to our eighth point of joy. Ultimate reality is spiritual. Psychedelics are said to induce ego dissolution, ego death, a dissolution of the self into some ultimate reality. And on the supernaturalist interpretation, this ultimate reality is God or the world's self or universal consciousness. And people who have these psychedelic experiences, if they're atheists, they become converted to theism, like Benny Shannon. These views again conflict with science. So let's turn to spiritual naturalism. A little naturalist background. We talked about how spirit in our universe is a thermodynamic force. But spirit in our universe, our possible world, the actual world, is just an expression of ultimate spirit. Ultimate spirit, it's not analyzed using supernaturalism, it's analyzed using Platonic naturalism. Logic here is one of the natural sciences, and the one and the good are taken to be logical objects. The one is being itself, and being itself is entirely non-mental, and it's impersonal. The one is not God. Here, ultimate spirit is just the power of the one directed towards the good. I think it's worth pointing out, again, the one is not God, right? Some people writing about psychedelics under the influence of the perennial philosophy often think being itself, God, world consciousness, the universal spirit, these are all the same. They're not. We have to analyze these things and sort them out. So the one is not God, it's just being itself. And ultimate spirit is the power of the one directed towards the good. Let's go back to our 8th point of joy on the spiritual naturalist interpretation. Ego dissolution is about being itself. It's the dissolution of the self as a being among beings into the ground of being, which is just being itself. And many people who are atheists have atheistic mystical experiences, and they write about the dissolution of the self into being itself. I'll just mention Comte de Sponville here. On this view, psychedelics don't convert atheists into theists. You can be an atheist and have full-blown mystical experiences. So this is my conclusion then, that psychedelics do reveal the joyous cosmology. And the joyous cosmology has 8 points of joy. It says that materialism is false. Things are animated by spirits. Nature is filled with spiritual beings. Everything is spiritually connected. Everything is spiritually meaningful. Everything is spiritually optimal. And there are many worlds filled with spiritual beings. So here, ultimate reality is spiritual as well. The unique revelations induced by psychedelics, the revelation of the joyous cosmology, does not require Cartesian mind-body dualism. It does not need to be interpreted in terms of supernaturalism, in terms of Western esotericism, in terms of theism, or in terms of any of those things. The 8 points of joy and the joyous cosmology itself are more rationally interpreted in terms of information, and thus in terms of spiritual naturalism. This sort of interpretation builds on the emerging position in contemporary mathematics, contemporary physics, contemporary computer science, which tries to understand physical reality in terms of information theory and fundamental informational concepts, connected, of course, to ontic structural realism, informational structural realism, and similar physical positions. We don't need supernaturalism to interpret the 8 points of joy, and you don't have to be a supernaturalist to affirm the joyous cosmology. Naturalism can affirm the joyous cosmology. So thank you very much. That's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderfully concise and thought-provoking and profound, very comprehensive explanation. It definitely set me in a direction that I'm going to be following up on some of these threads myself. This has
Sure.
been fantastic.
Glad to have been
Thank
here.
you. Thank you to everybody. Hopefully you can join us again for the final presentation, where we'll be looking at how we can weave philosophical inquiry into the psychedelic world. Thank you. Until next time, stay thoughtful.